Right, so I am Dr. Gloria Mfeka Nkabinde. I'm a family physician and a lecturer here in the Department of Family Medicine at UKZN. I have been a family physician for the last 12 years. And 5 of those 12 years I've spent working in a rural district hospital in a lovely part of rural northern KZN in Bethesda Hospital. That was probably one of the best years of my life. In terms of my teaching contribution at the university, I teach both undergraduate and postgraduate students. I currently coordinate and run the final year rotation in family medicine, which is what we call the rural block or the rural rotation. So in terms of my research, prior to joining the university, I had not done much at all. But part of what I had done whilst working in a rural setting was to try and address the high rates of adolescent pregnancies in rural northern KZN. And I did this by starting what we call the Zazi camps, which essentially we used to camp out in high schools for 2 days with girls and offer contraception, HIV testing, talks in terms of empowerment to encourage girls to attain an education and a career in a future that will serve them well. But I found myself lacking in terms of understanding how adolescents really live with their sexuality and their fertility in this rural setting. I found that many of the interventions we tried to come with were almost quite reductionist and almost reduced pregnancy or adolescent pregnancy per se as a health problem. Now, when I moved to the university, I then embarked on a PhD study, which really sought to understand this a little bit deeper. And so currently I do a lot of work around adolescent sexual and reproductive health. I also do a bit of health systems research, but mainly in mother and child. And so my current research interest is really in the social sciences space, trying to understand how rural adolescents construct and make meaning of their fertility in a rural setting. And one of the things that I've found is that fertility is influenced by a plethora of issues. And those might be socialization, it might be gender, it might be economics, it might be politics, it might be religion, right? And so if we simply look at pregnancy or adolescent pregnancy as a health issue, we're going to miss all these either dynamics or factors that have an influence on why they fall pregnant, right? So, for example, within the socialization space, families, right, play a huge role as a socializing unit, right? And in northern KZN, in terms of how girls and boys are socialized, it's quite divergent. Boys are encouraged to pursue relationships, whereas girls are encouraged to keep themselves and to become virgins, right? So immediately you've got an intersection of tradition and modernity, because whether parents like it or not and whether families like it or not, adolescents are sexually active, which means that they're having relationships. And so we need to investigate these relationships. And so in many of these relationships, one of the things I've found is the enormous amount of sexual coercion and sexual aggression that takes place, which could account for some of these pregnancies. The lack of knowledge around understanding what mutual sexual consent is within these relationships, which shows that there is still a lot of education that needs to be done, but it's not just about giving information, it's about allowing them to develop the necessary skills to practice mutual sexual consent. So that really blew me away, which is something that is easy to really overlook when you're simply focusing on contraception as a medical doctor, and not necessarily focus on the social-cultural, the gender dynamics within these relationships. A second big realization was within a setting of socioeconomic hardship, right, and systemic poverty, many girls are forced to leave their families to pursue an education to attain a good matric. But as they leave their families, they then rent out these rooms. In isiZulu, we call it emqashweni. And in renting out these rooms, they get into these rooms and they have to pay rent. They say, I've got no bed to sleep in. I sleep on the floor. I've got no wardrobe. I've got no stove. I've got no fridge. I need monthly groceries to survive. And so who becomes their support system to survive? It's older men who are wealthier and willing to support them, but in exchange for sexuality. And so girls are forced to have transactional relationships, right? To barter themselves in order to survive. And I think if we're not aware of these things, it has an impact then on how we even formulate interventions or strategies to address adolescent pregnancies. And perhaps a big one for me was the realization that actually not all adolescent pregnancies are unplanned or as a result of risky sexual behavior. Some adolescents are quite intentional about having babies, both girls and boys. And one of my key findings is that from the boys, in fact, when you have a child and you father a child, for them there is a translation into adult manhood, where they'll even begin to say, watch how you're talking to me and who you are talking to. I'm somebody's father. And so by taking on this social role of fatherhood, there is a translation into adult manhood. And for girls, for various reasons, similarly, a translation from girlhood to adult womanhood as they have babies. And some of them, they even have babies to fortify the relationships in which they're engaged. And lastly, as a means of economic survival, some of them have had children as well. And so this is some of the works that allows us, from the adolescent perspective themselves, to allow us to understand how do adolescents themselves construct their fertility and make meaning of their fertility, so that we don't make assumptions about their decisions, but get to hear it directly from them.